What Vladimir Putin just handed the Islamic Republic of Iran is not another routine nuclear cooperation agreement, and it is not a continuation of the civilian energy partnership that Rosatom has been running at Bushehr for the past 15 years. What landed on paper at 4:13 p.m. Moscow time yesterday is a strategic inflection point, and by the time I'm done walking you through the actual contents of this agreement, you are going to understand exactly why every senior nonproliferation analyst in Washington spent last night awake, and why the calls between the State Department, the Pentagon, and number 10 Downing Street did not stop until well after dawn. I want you to sit with the actual numbers for a moment because the framing you are getting from Reuters and the AP is sanitized in a way that obscures what is actually happening. The agreement signed yesterday transfers 47 metric tons of uranium hexafluoride feedstock from Russian stockpiles to the Natanz and Fordo enrichment facilities over an 18-month delivery window. It authorizes Rosatom technical personnel, 312 of them according to the annex, to be embedded inside Iranian centrifuge halls in advisory roles. It establishes a joint enrichment venture with output ceilings that, on paper, stay below weapons grade thresholds, but the language governing those ceilings is written with deliberate ambiguity that any treaty lawyer would recognize on a first read. This is not damaged non-proliferation architecture. This is not limping non-proliferation architecture. This is the deliberate, methodical dismantling of the entire framework that has constrained Iranian nuclear development for 2 decades. Having spent decades watching how Russia uses nuclear cooperation as a geopolitical instrument, I can tell you that the specific isotope being transferred matters enormously. The uranium hexafluoride moving under this agreement is not natural uranium feedstock at the 0.7% U-235 baseline. It is pre-enriched material in the 5 to 19.75% enrichment band, what non-proliferation specialists call low-enriched uranium plus or LEU plus, and what the rest of us call the material that closes about 90% of the technical distance between civilian fuel and a weapon. For those of you who didn't spend years in safeguards verification, let me translate what that means operationally. The hardest, most time consuming, most centrifuge intensive part of the enrichment process is the journey from natural uranium to 20% enriched uranium. Once you are above 20%, the remaining work to reach 90% weapons grade is comparatively trivial. It is a matter of weeks with the right cascade configuration, not years. Russia just handed Iran the back end of that journey. Russia just handed Iran the part of the process that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was specifically designed to prevent any state actor from providing to Tehran. And the agreement does this under the legal cover of a civilian fuel cycle partnership that, on its surface, looks like the same kind of arrangement Rosatom has running in half a dozen countries. But if you think this transfer happened in isolation, if you think Putin signed this agreement without months of preparation behind it, you have not been paying attention to how Russian strategic planning actually operates. Stay with me because what I'm about to walk you through is the part of the analysis that is going to be missing from every cable news segment tonight. This agreement was not negotiated in the 3 weeks since Foreign Minister Aragchi flew to Moscow. The framework text bears the unmistakable structural fingerprints of a document that has been in development since at least mid-2024. The financial architecture alone, the ruble-denominated escrow mechanism that bypasses dollar clearing entirely, the gold-backed settlement provisions, the carve-outs for sanctioned Iranian banks to participate through Russian intermediaries, none of that gets drafted in a month. That is a year of legal engineering minimum by people who knew exactly which sanctions provisions they needed to root around and exactly which secondary sanction triggers they needed to avoid pulling. Three things are happening simultaneously in this agreement, and the simultaneity is the entire point. The uranium feedstock transfer addresses the material constraint. The technical advisory presence at Natanz and Fordo addresses the expertise constraint, and the financial settlement architecture addresses the sanctions constraint. Iran has been operating under all three of those constraints for the better part of a decade, and Putin just dissolved them in a single coordinated package. That is not opportunism. That is not Russia improvising in response to Western pressure. That is a mature, sophisticated geopolitical play that was sitting in a drawer in the Kremlin waiting for the right window to be executed, and the window opened the moment American attention was sufficiently absorbed elsewhere. The signing happened at 4:13 p.m. Moscow time. And I want you to understand why that specific timing matters, because nothing about a signing of this magnitude is left to scheduling convenience. 4:13 p.m. in Moscow is 9:13 a.m. on the East Coast of the United States. That is the precise moment when the National Security Council's morning intelligence brief has just concluded, when the Principals Committee has dispersed to their respective departments, and when the operational tempo of the Washington interagency is at its lowest coordination point of the day. The signing was timed to land in American intelligence channels at exactly the moment when the bureaucratic machinery for generating a coordinated response was least capable of generating one. It was time to give Russian state media a 6-hour window to set the global narrative before the White House podium produced its first official response. It was timed so that European foreign ministries, which were closing for the evening, would not be able to coordinate a unified statement until the following morning. Having been in rooms where these kinds of timing decisions get analyzed after the fact, I can tell you that the choice of 4:13 p.m. Moscow time was not a calendar artifact. It was a deliberate exploitation of the seams in the Western response architecture, and it worked exactly as it was designed to work. I want you to understand what an agreement of this scope does to the global non-proliferation regime, because the consequences extend far beyond the bilateral relationship between Moscow and Tehran. The entire architecture of nuclear restraint that has held since 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself, the IAEA safeguard system, the Nuclear Suppliers Group export controls, the additional protocols, all of it depends on a single foundational assumption. That assumption is that the five recognized nuclear weapon states will not actively assist non-weapon states in acquiring weapons-relevant capabilities. Russia just walked away from that assumption in a way that cannot be walked back. Every threshold state watching this, and there are more of them than the public discussion acknowledges, just received a demonstration that the floor has shifted. Saudi Arabia is watching, Turkey is watching, South Korea is watching. The conversations happening in those capitals tonight are not about whether to respond. They are about what their own nuclear options now look like in a world where one permanent member of the Security Council has unilaterally decided that the rules no longer apply. The psychological floor of the entire nonproliferation regime, the belief that there were lines the great powers would not cross, just collapsed. You think you've heard the worst of it? You haven't, because the uranium agreement is arriving at exactly the moment when four other strategic dynamics are converging on the Western response architecture, and the convergence is what makes this moment categorically different from previous Russia-Iran cooperation announcements. First, the American-Iran sanctions enforcement infrastructure has been degraded by 3 years of partial waivers, partial reauthorizations, and inconsistent enforcement under successive administrations. The institutional muscle memory for executing a coordinated maximum pressure response is not what it was in 2018. Second, the European unity that drove the original JCPOA negotiations has fractured along multiple axes, and the snapback mechanism that theoretically still exists in UN Security Council Resolution 2231 has expired as of October last year, removing the primary legal instrument for restoring international sanctions. Third, the Israeli strategic calculation regarding preventive military action has fundamentally shifted in the wake of the events at Natanz earlier this year, and the political space in Jerusalem for a unilateral kinetic response is wider than it has been at any point since 2012. And fourth, the Chinese position, which has historically provided diplomatic cover for restraint on both sides, has hardened in a direction that effectively gives Moscow a free hand. Each of those dynamics in isolation would be manageable. The convergence of all four arriving simultaneously on a Western response apparatus that is already stretched across Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific, and domestic political turbulence is something the system has not been stress tested against. Behind closed doors right now in the Situation Room and in the equivalent rooms in London, Paris, Berlin, and Jerusalem, the conversation is not about whether the uranium agreement crosses a red line. That conversation ended yesterday. The conversation now is about what response options actually remain available, and the honest answer that the people in those rooms are confronting is that the toolkit has been hollowed out by exactly the kind of long-term Russian strategic planning that produced this agreement in the first place. Sanctions on Russia are largely already imposed. Sanctions on Iran are largely already imposed. Diplomatic isolation has been attempted and has produced diminishing returns. The military options carry escalation risks. that compound across the Ukrainian theater, the Levantine theater, and the Persian Gulf theater simultaneously. What officials will not say publicly, but what people in the room know, is that the response menu Putin left for Washington was constructed with the same care as the agreement itself, and every available option on that menu carries a cost that the Western alliance is no longer in a strong position to absorb. A threshold has been crossed, and the next 24 to 48 hours of statements out of Washington, Brussels, and Jerusalem will define whether the international response shapes the trajectory of this agreement or simply ratifies it. The uranium is already moving. The Rosatom personnel are already being credentialed. The financial settlement architecture is already being activated through the bypass channels that the agreement formalizes. Every hour of delayed response is an hour during which the agreement's operational reality calcifies into a fait accompli that no subsequent diplomatic action can reverse. What does it say about the state of American deterrence that an agreement of this magnitude was negotiated, finalized, and signed without the response apparatus generating sufficient warning to prevent it? At what point does a non-proliferation regime that cannot prevent this kind of transfer stop being a regime and start being a memory of one? The ink on the agreement is dry. It is. The uranium is in the pipeline. The smoke is still rising over a framework that held for half a century. And the question that is being asked behind closed doors right now is whether anything that comes next will look like the world we thought we were living in yesterday morning.